Fred, we are back once again for Axiom 2 today. I'm doing well. Are you doing well?
Yeah, doing well. It occurred to me that we should probably make up short summary phrases for each of these axioms.
Nice.
I tried, when I was first reading through it, I tried to do that, and I got down around the 8th or 9th one, and the summary ideas turned out to be so long that I just decided, okay, this is not going to work. But maybe since we're patiently working through each of the axioms, we'll be able to come up with a summary title, which will at least help us, with the blog posts, if nothing else. I think this one's pretty straightforward. If Axiom 1 was on the meaning of the word Trinity, this one's really on Trinity of persons. The problem is that's maybe too Delphic, right? Anything about the Trinity is kind of about Trinity of persons. But the big point that Polanus is making with his second axiom is that Trinity, threeness, Trinity applies to persons in God, and not at all to the substance. Maybe that'd be a better summary. Trinity, not in substance, but in persons.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great handle. Maybe it could be tweaked here or there, but Trinity of persons is definitely what's going on. Shall we read the first sentence again like we did last time here?
That'd be great. You want to do that?
There is Trinity not in essence, which is single, but in the number of persons and the distinction of them. And then he starts quoting Tertullian and goes on from there.
Yeah, so it strikes me that this is another, just as in Axiom 1, he flagged the word Trinity as a homonym, or that is to say that it's equivocal. You might mean something by it that Christian theology doesn't mean, just by the word itself. He's doing that same kind of move here, where he's saying, well, you might say Trinity and think, and then unpack that to mean that within the essence of God, there is threeness, properly in the essence. He wants to say, no, it's not a statement about the essence, it's a statement about the persons.
The numbered persons. And he starts quoting Tertullian right off. Tertullian was crazy early. He's quoting here from one of the earliest works on Trinitarian theology. I know you know a fair amount about that. Why don't you tell us about
Yeah, so he's quoting from Adversus Praxium, contra Praxium, I guess, in Latin. And so when I get to teach a class on the Trinity, I'm in a hurry to get to Nicaea. And then there's the question of, there's the question of, well, what do you read if you're only going to spend a week, or at the most generous 2 weeks at the earlier stuff, after the Bible and before the 4th century? On the one hand, there's so much great stuff. There's so much wonderful stuff to read all over the Christian world. Everyone's kind of hammering out how to talk properly about what they see in Scripture about God as Father, Son, and Spirit. On the other hand, it's all a little weird and sloppy. And so when I can only give it 1 week, what I assign for students is Tertullian against Praxeus. And it's great. It's got it all. So on the one hand, Tertullian, this North African church father, is the first person to use the formula, one substance in 3 persons.
Yeah, and he's the first, if I recall, to use the Latin word Trinitas. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, so he's in one sense, he's got it all exactly right. He's this North African person with legal training, and he says the word Trinity. He says 3 persons in 1 substance. What more could you ask for? It's the immediate impression. It's like, yes, Trinity was, we didn't even have to wait for Nicaea. It's all right here. But then he goes on and says lots of things that sort of spoil everything in one sense. His use of terms is, as we'll see in a minute, non-standard. Of course, it would be because it's so early. But also, he's probably some kind of Stoic materialist. When you can make him do metaphysics, it's not very good, right? He seems to think that spirit is extremely fine matter or something like that.
Fred, it strikes me, those who start reading historical sources on the Trinity from the tradition, and wherever you start, it's always an education. One thing that I think most people become immediately aware of when they start studying these really early works, especially pre-Nicaea, is just how wonky some of these early church fathers were. So as you approach these early statements about the mystery of Trinity before the development of dogmatic formulae, as we see in the councils and the creeds, as the Spirit of God, worked out through holy men, however you want to parse how that working happened. How do we judge these fathers? What use do they have today? And how do we confront the fact that sometimes they're saying really weird stuff about such a basic mystery that we want to make like the sum and substance of all Christian theology, especially as Trinitarian theologians ourselves? How do we handle these things?
Yeah. Well, like I say, it's no good hiding it. I assign this text and say, jump in there and read it. It's going to be surprising. It takes you into a whole other thought world. It takes you into, different cultural formation. And you just have to work. The nice thing about something like Against Praxeus is it's a great enough text that it repays very close study, but not because it's incredibly self-consistent. I teach in a great books program. And so we're always gambling on like Homer is one person and he's probably divinely inspired in some way. And the whole text hangs together, and let's at least gamble on coherence and continuity within this text. That's kind of a test of a great book. And Against Praxeus is in that ballpark, but I wouldn't argue strongly for its consistency. Even in the terms that Polanus quotes here, there's some strangeness, I think. And I say quote, he presents it as a quote, although I see in your translation it says, this is akin to what Tertullian says. Because it doesn't seem to be a direct quote from Against Praxeus 2 or 3. It's one of those two chapters is where he's getting this. It seems to be like a summarizing quote, the best I can tell, that he's, at least I couldn't put my finger on the exact sequence of words.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have the Latin in front of me, so I don't know where I got the akin idea from, but my Latin skills are, of course, infallible. So
Yeah. Well, I think it's I think he's not quoting verbatim Tertullian, but he's telling you what he gets from, and it is this section Against Praxeus chapters 2 and 3. So early on.
Right.
Well, here's what he says. It's akin to what Tertullian says. The unity of the monarchy is the trinity of the economy, and one does not destroy the other. Now, he's writing in Latin, so he says dispensatio, but he uses in his Latin text a Greek word, Tertullian that is, uses the Greek word oikonomia, which is this, it's a Bible word. It means, that's where we get the word economy.
Like household or administration, something like that.
Yeah, the administration of a household. In the New Testament, it also gets translated as a stewardship, where Paul says that he's a steward and he has a stewardship, specifically a stewardship of the mystery. And in early patristic uses, it pretty quickly comes to be sort of shorthand for the incarnation.
So that's even the broader salvific acts and unfolding of salvation history, which is of course concentrated in.
Yeah, as it all sort of is consummated and
consummated.
reaches its peak in the incarnation.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly you'll find Greek church fathers just saying, well, according to the economy, meaning the Son of God in his incarnate state.
Right. And a lot of people today are going to be familiar with the word economy as it relates to Trinitarian discourse, in contrast to what is often called the immanent Godhead. So the immanent Godhead, as we talk about it today, is going to be God within himself, eternally, who he is without the world. And then economically speaking, we're talking about creature land. And would you say that's how Tertullian is using the word economy here? Or
yeah, so that is the main thing to know about the use of the word economy in the history of Trinitarian theology. Within the being of God. So that on the one hand, there is a monarchy, there is only, one God, one arche or principle. But within that, even the word monarchy is a little too loaded, isn't it? Within that single principle of the deity, there is a particular arrangement. That's what he means by the monarchy has the unity, but that doesn't exclude the oikonomia, which has the Trinity.
And so as I understand you, Fred, economy here is more of a synonym of arrangement or like taxis.
It really is, yeah. Tertullian uses the word oikonomia or economy here and means something like taxis within the Trinity. Yeah.
Yeah. So picking out the taxis, one of the interesting things, and you mentioned some inherent tension within Tertullian's work against praxeos. It also has to do with this issue of economy and how we get to the economy within God, the taxis, the eternal taxis, from what we call the economy as far as creature land. And that move is really complex, quite complicated, as we know, moving from creatures or speaking of God from within the created realm.
Yeah.
It's rather interesting to me to think about how this term comes to be deployed to mean eternal taxis in someone like a Tertullian, and it does seem, because it's so closely tied to the salvific revelation of God in time, the functionally moving from created realm to taxis, they're tied so closely together in Tertullian, and that's actually where a lot of maybe some of the problems he developed is right in that tie. But nonetheless, we can't untie them either with respect to how we know who God is.
Yeah. So it's interesting, when I teach this, I usually say sort of avert your eyes from this use of the word economy, because it's not going to be how the rest of our readings in this course are going to function, right? But the other thing you can do is lean into it and say, why is he using it? You can think about the ordering of the divine household within God himself, right? So that would be one way of getting at it. And actually, some of the other Protestant scholastics will go that route. Petrus von Maastricht has a lot of household imagery functioning throughout his doctrine of the Trinity, both within God and between God and the world. So if you think about it that way, like, where is God at home? Well, he's at home with us in his temple, of course, but God's home, would be God's own self. So that's one way you could go with it.
It's the God with respect to us sort of move that Luther deploys or Barth deploys. It's going to be similar to that sort of thing. Would you say?
Yeah, or I think even in Deep Things of God, I might put it this way to kind of get both senses of home out of it. So on the one hand, God is at home with us in the temple, right? But God's real home is just God. And so you could use home language, not only for the economy of salvation, but for the home life of God, or what I call, the happy land of the Trinity. Petrus von Maastricht will go that way with it. I don't know enough of Tertullian's Latin culture to know if, when he sees that word, the right Latin translation of it is dispensatio, right? And that's kind of a rhetorical term as much as it is anything, right? The idea that I've got a bunch of stuff to say, but then how am I going to dispense that? I will lay it out according to a certain ordering. And so he could have that kind of analogy running his mind, where he thinks, there is only one God. There is a single principle, monarcheia. But that doesn't exclude a particular ordering within God, or, as you said, taxis. All right. Well, Polanus deploys that little bit of Tertullian right there, and then goes straight into Aquinas, which is what, like a 1100-year jump to in terms of taking big.
Well, that's what happens with Trinity, right? You have the early church, and then you have Thomas. Sometimes I think that's where we stop. But of course, it's not true.
Yeah. He'll do lots of other things in the tradition. It is just, Tertullian said this kind of ambiguous thing you have to understand a certain way. Now let's go to Thomas.
Thomas, who solves all of our problems. Yeah, my feeling is I would not be surprised if he likely drops Tertullian here, particularly because he's the first father using Trinitas, and so he wants to bring the whole of church history together on this question. But he does want to get to Thomas Aquinas, because Thomas really shows quite well, I think, one of his main contributions is how this last phrase from Tertullian, one does not destroy the other. There's no butting of heads between God's unity and God's Trinity at all. And we talked a little bit about this last time when we mentioned the rational distinction between God's unity and one, a person with the divine essence who just is the divine essence. And Thomas he really equips us quite well to make sure that even though from our side there seems to be a butting of heads where one should destroy the other, one does not equal three, and three does not equal one for us.
Yeah.
But rather, this is not the case. There's no problem as it is in God.
Yeah. So Polanus jumps to the Summa Theologia, Part 1, question 31. And the article within it is there Trinity in God? And so what he wants to say here is, it's a yes and no, and he makes a distinction. Actually, in this reply that Polanus quotes, he quotes only the middle section of it. The first part, Aquinas makes a distinction. Then there's the part that Polanus quotes. And then the third part of this reply Thomas uses his characteristic language of suppositum. And that's one of those things where, well, that's a more abstract way of talking about what a person is. And you either have to really go all the way with it and start talking suppositum, or again, kind of avert your eyes and say, well, let's selectively quote and not use the part where Aquinas begins deploying that set of terms. I think that's one of the things going on here. Polanus does depend on the distinction that Thomas makes without quoting it. So what is the distinction is, what is it? Trinity could mean two things. Trinity could mean either number or the thing which is numbered, right? So if you're going to talk about threeness, you could be talking about the number threeness, threeness of number, or three things that are so numbered. So that's, Aquinas gives a whole sentence to saying, here's a distinction I make. Polanus doesn't quote that sentence, but then he does quote, when we say Trinity and unity, we don't impose number on the unity of essence, as if there were 3 times 1. Rather, we intend the numbered persons. So that's the number versus
it's
things
the
numbered.
Concretely numbered plurality that is a real plurality. But that plurality is only with respect to the persons. It's not a plurality in the essence.
Yeah.
Right?
Which means that number, the first possible meaning of Trinity, number itself is not characterizing the divine nature. It is simply not a statement about the divine nature.
Right. And again, this is where something you and I talked about last time with respect to Axiom 1 is really helpful. So when Thomas, for instance, says we intend the numbered persons, he's dropping a word that is a knowledge word. So intend, intentional, these sorts of things are knowledge words. And for Thomas, whenever we make a judgment of the truth of a statement, that judgment terminates or is intended toward the object that is the terminus of that statement. And so for Thomas, again, on the strength of special revelation, we gather up, and 3 times we're making a judgment that is terminating really in one person. And we're never coming up to these 3 persons themselves and collecting them, because of course we can't encroach upon God. We can't get up there and crawl around and look at what's going on there. But rather from below, we can relate in our intellectual acts of judgment toward each one of those persons, make a true statement that each one is God. And then we count up those concretely numbered intellectual acts, each of which has a terminus. And that's where we get the 3 idea from, is the number of what is actually numbered.
Yeah. Yeah, later on in the Summa, in the section on the Trinity, Aquinas will say that divine things are named by our intellect, not as they are in themselves, but as they are named by our intellect. And that's, that's not a denial of the judgments that are made about the persons of the Trinity, but it's just to say that when we're doing that, we're not like up there looking around pointing at things.
Right. We never have that privileged access of God that God himself has. We only have a creaturely access that is fundamentally principled from creaturely things.
Yeah.
And as Thomas says in the sentence commentary, our names are shaped, we might say shaped, more from where we take them from than from where we put them to. So if I name something, where I've taken that name from more determines my naming rather than what I'm naming. And that's really important for Thomas in his theology.
Yeah. Maybe two ways of unpacking this distinction he makes here is, one would be the response in Aquinas that Polanus is quoting. The objection that it's a response to, the objection is an attempt to use simplicity against Trinity, actually. So objection number 4 in this question is, all that is in God is in the unity of the divine essence, since God is his own essence. Therefore, there's not Trinity in God, right? So the disputed thing is there Trinity in God? The objection is probably not, because simplicity. And so anything in the divine essence is just God, so how could there be Trinity? And Polanus then responds, follows Aquinas in responding, right, this is not something that is in the essence. So that's one way of getting at it, is to think that, as Aquinas is entertaining objections, one that he entertains is the possibility that you could try to deploy divine simplicity against Trinity. It reminds me of a modern argument I've heard. I know it's in William Craig and J.P. Moreland's book. I can't remember if they affirm it, deny it, or just talk about it. But the question is something like, if triunity is a divine attribute, and the Father is God, if it's a property, that's right. That's better language. Then
it's worse.
The Father has to have it. Yeah, you're right.
Just joking.
It's more accurate
well, actually,
to the way.
I'm not joking, but yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Property is a more accurate word for the way Moreland and Craig talk when they talk about this.
Yeah.
If it's a if triunity is a divine property and the Father is God, then he has to have that divine property. And then the Son has to have that divine property. And what follows from that would be logically absurd. It would be that the Father would himself be a Trinity, right? And the Son himself would have the attribute of triunity, sort of characterizing him as one who has the divine properties. And I don't know if it goes fractal from there, right? If you get like more, if the threes become nines, becomes 27.
Right, it ends either you deny the Trinity or you're tritheist, is what it ends in. When you start these property arguments, and this is such a common mistake. I see it all the time. There's not the Aristotelian understanding of the distinction between what are absolute accidents and what is a relative accident or a relation. And an absolute if there was an absolute accident that any one of the persons had in distinction from the others, then we would be tritheist, right?
Yeah.
And so talk of properties which is ill supported by the distinction between absolute accidents and relative accidents. It gets you into hot water very, very fast. And of course, Polanus is he's never going to deploy something absolute to distinguish persons. He's going to deploy a relation, which not only distinguishes, but also constitutes persons as really distinct.
Yeah. So that would be nice. When he jumped from Tertullian to Aquinas, of course, he jumped Augustine. Augustine would be able to distinguish the persons by speaking according to relation of them. And he'll be very explicit on the Trinity that when he does that, he is not predicating things of the divine nature. He's not speaking.
It's not extra formalities that are absolute perfections, right?
It's not substance wise, I think, is Edmund Hill's translation, right? He's speaking not substance wise, but relation wise. Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, I think that's implicit in what Polanus is doing here as he kind of gets from the 2nd century to the 13th century. It would have been nice to have a little stop in the 5th century, though, to make
For
explicit.
Augustine.
Yeah, yeah.
Fred, what do you think of this statement here that comes right after his quotation of Thomas? He says, this affirmation works both ways. The three persons are that single divine essence. And the point is, we can say the three persons are that single divine essence, and vice versa. The divine essence is the three persons. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I'm not sure what he's quoting there exactly.
I don't think it's a quote. I think it's just, I had that question myself. I
That's
think
what
it's just,
follows from what Aquinas
it's just
says.
an affirmation that,
Yeah.
that I've put in quotes instead of inserting the vice versa. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's good, because then he's got this other strange language as he's kind of explaining that about the essence not being broader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Yeah, it's with any of these sentences, the more you talk about the three and the one, it's just really hard to frame the sentences the right way. You've only got so many shots at saying it well and intercepting all possible misunderstandings before you reach semantic overload just from having said the word three too many times.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of loses its ability to signify because you've said it so many different ways. But yeah, the three persons are the divine essence. And you could say it the other way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here's the line. Because it's clear that the divine essence is not broader than the actual three persons. It's not like when you've talked about the three persons, there's some sort of leftover divine essence that you weren't just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And vice versa. The persons are not broader than the essence. There's not, it's kind of that inside outside language that we used last time, just in a slightly different key.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And then he ends this axiom by saying, so here's how we shouldn't talk. We shouldn't say that God is triple according to his essence. We could say he's triple under the concept of persons.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to say that God is the multiplicity or the triplicity, but you want to say he's the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
Lest one think of more divine essences.
Right.
And I think that what Polanus is going for there is the goal is to clarify so that we can talk about these revealed things about God without using misleading terms. We don't want to lead people the wrong way in the way we talk about it. And I think, but in both of the first two axioms, he's worried that the very word Trinity itself is open to misunderstanding, and so we've got to make sure we're not misunderstanding it.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I think about this a lot. So, for instance, I'm being forced here to translate Latin into English and then say we shouldn't be saying these words, but the words I'm saying we shouldn't be saying are English when in fact they were in Latin. And so the translation issue and the sensitivity that, for instance, Thomas Aquinas will sit down and he'll give you a list of words that you shouldn't say. And the sensitivities that are driving that, as you mentioned really well, are just to guide against misconstrual, misunderstanding of what we're actually thinking and understanding when we're using these creaturely terms to try to mutter out some helpful theology here. Yeah. But nowadays we have this really interesting scenario. We're all speaking English, but the academy is overlapped with the pew, and we're wanting to speak in really technical language in the academy and also in the pew, and making that transition. The same sensitivity has to be operative, but the issue of what words we should or shouldn't use is much more difficult to determine. And I think of this as, for instance, we saw a number of years ago the ESS debates.
Mm.
That's where I think a lot of the issue is just, oh, these are terms we wouldn't want to use. There are obviously substantive issues underlying, but a lot of it was, no, these are actually terms that if you start using them, you're gonna start thinking of bad things.
Yeah.
And, trying to resolve that issue is really tricky.
Yeah. So maybe a quick example is when I'm talking to ordinary Christians, whatever that is, right? So outside of the more academic context, and they'll say the three members of the Trinity do such and such. And yeah, I always have to decide, like, do I correct them and say, members is just not a word you're going to want to go with, because they don't mean anything pernicious by members. They're not thinking that God is a committee, right? And committees have members. They're not thinking that God is a body and a body has members. They're mostly not thinking, and I totally sympathize with, I just need a word for what there's three of. The Bible doesn't give me a word for what there's three of in God. So I'm going to say members. And I'm always having to kind of pick my targets and say, I'm going to let that slide, because otherwise I'm going to introduce a level of precision that really for them is just going to mean, here's the formula, memorize it, and use it from now on.
Exactly. And then that converts to a weird manualism that we just start reciting these things without actual understanding of what we're saying.
Yeah.
I've noticed that as well, is if you start imposing the proper way to talk about Trinity on folks who aren't, they're all right. They can just use the word members and go home, and they're just as saved as me, and they can pray just as well as me, probably better. But if you start imposing that propriety of technical language, it can quite easily backfire and actually become a worse situation for that individual.
Now, every now and then you'll hear someone say something like, but the Father part of God is different from the Son part of God. And it all depends on the context. Like, okay, I can never affirm the sentence you just said, but but overall, as part of a communication event where we're trying to come to terms here, or we're not trying to come to terms, literally, we're trying to develop a common understanding. I might lean in and say, this is a judgment call, but members, I can accept that at the level of normal conversation. Part, I think I just need to ask you one, maybe two Socratic questions to get you to acknowledge that you don't think God has parts in that sense. There's not like 1/3 of God is the Father's zone, which is discontinuous from this other third, which is the Son's zone. Nobody thinks that.
Fred, how do you develop that sort of wisdom or sensitivity to know when those corrections ought to be issued in a humble spirit and when you should just keep your tongue between your teeth and move on?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's an interpersonal judgment about the audience, the person you're talking with, and then some of it's just experience of. I have seen people use the word part frequently enough in their self-talk that it really actually messes up their ability to think about the three in one. Right. So there's no perfect answer to it. It's really it's an ad hoc decision about what's happening in this communication event. I mean, it may be worth saying, since we're doing this series on Polanus's Trinitarian axioms, this is not a series of conversations about getting to a certain kind of clarity and simplicity about how we talk. This is, you don't pick a text like this and go through it line by line unless you intentionally want to get out into the weeds of how Protestant theology has done this at a certain level of depth.
And that's where the practice of Christian prayer and humility comes in and that, the test of Christian love is really important here. I often think about Jesus's parting words, I've got more to tell you, but you cannot bear them now. I mean, none of us are Jesus. None of us are master teachers. That you can certainly find many, many better teachers than me, at least. But trying to to recognize that actually sometimes love means being silent, even in the face of some more minor mistakes, recognizing these things will work themselves out, recognizing that each one of us has lots of errors that we believe, but the other things we believe tend to push us in the right direction anyway, and we can still worship God well and grow in love for him.
Yeah, I should also say that in these conversations that we're having, we're getting out in the weeds on purpose, and we are pretty likely to sound more confused than we really are. I mean, one of the things that drew me to this set of axioms is there are some moments of great clarity, and I think in the big picture, there's a classical Protestant approach to this, which is starting from the divine unity, that I think is going to be really tonic, really helpful. For modern discourse.
Absolutely. In the breadth of the use of the tradition, it goes all the way back to Tertullian. He's using all these figures in the broad goalposts of orthodoxy and just the helpful way. And then the sensitivity to biblical language, sensitivity to translation, but sensitivity also to technicality as well.
Yeah.
Definitely useful to develop that, hopefully, in ourselves.
Even these first two have been really helpful to me to call to mind the possible problems of even using the word Trinity. Right? I mean, I'm on Team T word. I'm going to keep using it, but just to be really alert to the ways in which it can mislead people. Right? You could say Trinity of persons and not register the fact that what they're hearing is something like a group of three people.
Right,
or a divine essence divided up into thirds, or something like that. The very word itself has false associations for them that need to be intercepted.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, with that, shall we conclude?
Yeah, I think for the next two axioms, we're going to ring the changes on the word homoousios, right?
Yeah, we're going to learn all our fancy Greek words that we can whip out of our pockets and impress people.
That's going to be fun.
All right, Fred, thank you so much. Great to see you.
All right, see you then.